I want to tell you about the day I watched a human being change the course of diplomatic history without raising his voice once. Not with a weapon, not with a speech, not even with a threat. He just stood there and bled a little, and that was enough. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to where it actually started, which was a Tuesday morning on the orbital platform above Karavath Station, and I was standing at my post behind the secondary observation glass, holding a cup of rapidly cooling coffee and trying not to fall asleep on my feet. My name is Delegate Observer Senavral. I work for the Interspecies Diplomatic Monitoring Office, which sounds important but mostly means I stand in corners and take notes while people who are far more important than me argue about trade routes and atmospheric rights. I have been doing this job for 11 years. I have seen things that would make most people stop eating for a week. I have watched Garuvian ambassadors throw furniture. I have stood in a room while a Dreth delegation communicated entirely through controlled flatulence, which, for the record, is a legitimate signaling language, and I will not apologize for saying so in my official notes. I have seen a lot, but I had never seen anything like what happened that morning. So let me tell you about it properly. From the beginning, the way it actually felt to be standing there, watching it unfold, and slowly, very, very slowly, realizing I was witnessing something that would end up in textbooks. The platform was called Convergence Point the Lara. It was a massive, rotating station built into the upper atmosphere of a gas giant called Iluvith, which was itself in a star system called HR 7481 by human designations, or the Amber Cradle by the Kethosi who'd originally mapped it. The station had been constructed jointly by 6 species over about 40 years, and it showed. Different sections had different gravity, different atmospheric compositions, different lighting spectra. Walking from one wing to another was like walking through a series of alien paintings, everything slightly wrong in ways you couldn't immediately name. The central diplomatic hall, called the Convergence Chamber, was the size of 4 football stadiums stacked on top of each other. It had been designed to accommodate beings ranging from the massive, multi-limbed Vorathi down to the tiny, crystalline Shen, who existed mostly at a scale humans could only see properly with enhanced optics. The ceiling was so high that the far end of it was actually a different gravity zone. Lights hung at various heights to accommodate the vision spectra of a dozen species. It smelled, and I know this is a strange thing to say about a diplomatic chamber, it smelled like rain and copper, and something faintly sweet that I'd never been able to identify despite 11 years of exposure. The station's atmospheric engineers had apparently chosen the smell deliberately, selecting a blend that was inoffensive and slightly calming to the widest possible range of alien olfactory systems. I'd once asked one of them what the sweet smell was. She'd said, synthetic compound, we call it Accord 7. We add a tiny amount to the air recyclers in every wing that handles negotiations. Does it actually calm people down? She'd smiled in that way people smile when they know something you don't. It has a 13% reduction in vocal escalation incidents across 8 tested species. What about humans? 14%. I thought about that a lot. The morning in question, the morning that changed everything, was the opening session of what was formerly called the 6th Kethosi Human Trade and Territorial Framework Summit. Unofficially, everyone called it the renegotiation, because that's exactly what it was. 3 years earlier, the previous framework had collapsed in spectacular fashion when a misinterpreted gesture during a signing ceremony had been taken by the Kethosi senior delegate as a direct insult to his lineage. He'd left the session, filed a formal grievance with the Galactic Oversight Council, and the entire trade relationship between humanity and the Kethosi Dominion, which covered 11 star systems and approximately 400 billion sapient beings, had entered a state of polite, extremely tense suspension. 3 years of careful, glacial repair work had brought both sides back to this table. There was an enormous amount at stake. The Kethosi controlled the transit corridor through the Amber Cradle, and without that corridor, human ships making the deep run to the outer scatter, where 3 major human colony clusters lived, had to go around. Going around added between 8 and 14 months to every supply run. People out in those colonies were already stretched thin. They needed those trade routes. They needed this summit to work. Everyone knew it. Both delegations were walking in with the knowledge that failure wasn't really an option, which paradoxically was exactly the kind of pressure that made failure more likely. I had read the briefing files the night before, all 640 pages of them. I had not slept well. The human delegation entered first, as was protocol. The junior party enters the convergence chamber before the senior party, allowing the host's representative, in this case, the Laren station commander, named something I still cannot pronounce correctly, so I called her Commander Ashvith, which she seemed to accept, to formally invite both sides in. There were 9 people in the human delegation. Secretary for Interspecies Affairs, Myrla Ockafer, who led them, tall and silver-haired and wearing the dark blue formal diplomatic attire that the human diplomatic corps had settled on after 3 decades of debating what humans should wear to multi-species summits. Behind her, 4 senior attachés. Behind them, 2 security personnel in discreet tactical dress. And behind them, carrying a series of document cases and a portable display array, the assistant. His name, according to the delegate roster I'd been given, was listed simply as Cale Drant, personal assistant, Grade 7 diplomatic staff. Grade 7 is low. Grade 7 is the kind of staff level you get for people who carry things and take notes and refill water and quietly vanish into the background the moment they're not immediately needed. In 11 years of watching summits, I had never, not once, noticed a Grade 7 staff member enough to remember their face afterward. I noticed this one. I'm not sure I can explain exactly why even now. He wasn't physically remarkable, not in the way that makes you stare. Medium height, which for a human male meant he came up to about my ear. I'm Velhari, so I'm on the taller end for humanoid species. Brown skin, dark hair cut short and neat. Eyes that were, I remember this clearly, a very dark brown, almost black, the kind of eyes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. He moved quietly. He carried 3 cases that looked heavy without showing any strain. He smiled at the Commander Ashvith's aide when she showed the delegation to their seating section. Not a diplomatic smile, the kind that powerful people aim at you like a weapon. Just a genuine, tired, small smile. The kind of smile that says, I appreciate you showing me where to put these down. I remember thinking, there's someone who's been carrying things for a long time. And then I went back to watching Secretary Ockafer and forgot about him entirely. For about 20 minutes. Chapter 2, Ambassador Treshvacal. The Kethosi delegation arrived 18 minutes after the humans, which was itself a statement. Protocol allowed for up to 20 minutes, so 18 minutes was close enough to be technically punctual while also being unmistakably. We took our time. The Kethosi are physically an impressive species. They evolved on a high-gravity world, which means they're built dense and wide rather than tall. Their average height puts them at about chest level for a human, but they're broader and their musculature is of a different kind entirely. It's less about lifting and more about a constant, powerful isometric compression, the kind of strength that comes from spending millions of years on a world trying to push you into the ground. Their skin ranges from gray-blue to deep slate depending on age and caste, and they have 4 arms, 2 large primary arms and 2 smaller secondary arms that emerge from lower on the torso. Their faces are broad and flat with large, iridescent eyes and no visible nose. They breathe through a pair of gill-like structures on their necks. They are one of the oldest spacefaring species that humanity had yet encountered. Their civilization was about 9,000 years old. They had seen human beings show up in the Amber Cradle about 130 years ago and had been dealing with us with an expression, insofar as I could read Kethosi facial cues, which I was only marginally good at of someone who has been quietly tolerating an over-curious child for longer than they'd anticipated. Their lead ambassador was named Treshvacal. He was a clade elder, which in Kethosi society was roughly equivalent to being both a head of state and a kind of sacred lineage representative simultaneously. There was a religious dimension to the title that the Kethosi had repeatedly explained to human diplomats, and that human diplomats had repeatedly failed to fully grasp. He was old. How old exactly was difficult to say because Kethosi aging is nonlinear, but the blue of his skin had gone deep almost to black, and his secondary arms were slightly atrophied in the way that happened to very senior Kethosi as they aged. He moved slowly and with enormous deliberate weight, aided by 2 carved support staves that were themselves ancient and decorated with the symbology of his lineage. He was accompanied by 12 members of his delegation, a retinue of 6 Kethosi guards in ceremonial armor, which was not merely decorative, I knew from experience, since Kethosi's ceremonial armor was actually quite functional, and 2 translators. He also had an aide, a young Kethosi female named Vilith San, who was his primary personal assistant, and who moved with the quick, nervous energy of someone who had worked for an extremely demanding principal for long enough to have developed a kind of constant low-level anxiety as a baseline state. I recognized the type. I'd been that person once early in my career. The opening session went fine. Fine in the way that opening sessions always go fine, which is to say that everyone was on their best behavior, and nothing of real consequence was said or decided, because nothing of real consequence is ever said or decided on the first day of a summit. You spend the first day establishing protocols, confirming the terms of engagement, doing the formal verbal ritual of, "We are all here in good faith and seek mutual benefit," that both sides know is at least partially theater, but that everyone agrees to perform sincerely anyway. Secretary Ockhafer was good at this. She'd been doing it for 30 years. She had the particular gift of sounding warm and genuine while saying very precisely calculated things, and she deployed it with the effortless fluency of long practice. Ambassador Treshvakal said little. He had translators relay most of his statements, which was itself a form of communication. It put distance between himself and the proceedings, establishing that he was not yet willing to engage directly. He watched everything with those large, iridescent eyes, and his face gave away almost nothing. I watched him watch the human delegation. At one point, I noted this in my observation log, his gaze settled on the grade 7 assistant, who at that moment was quietly setting up a secondary display screen near Secretary Ockhafer's position. The gaze lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then it moved on. I wrote Ambassador Treshvakal noted the human assistant, unknown significance. Then I crossed it out, because it seemed like an odd thing to include. Later, I wished I'd left it in. The first session broke at midday local station time for a 90-minute recess. Protocol during recess was for both delegations to retire to their respective preparation suites, for the observers and monitoring staff to remain in the chamber or the adjacent observation areas, and for the catering staff to come in and replace the water and the various species-appropriate refreshment arrangements. I went and stood by the window that looked out over the gas giant. Iluvith was enormous below us, great orange-brown bands moving in slow, geological sweeps, storms the size of small moons spinning at their edges. From up here, you got no sense of the scale of it. It looked almost serene, the way all enormous things look serene from a sufficient distance. "It helps," said a voice next to me. I turned. The human assistant, Cale Drant, was standing about 2 feet away, also looking at the planet. "I'm sorry." "Looking at it," he said. He had a quiet voice, not soft exactly, just unpushy, like he was choosing his volume carefully. "First day of a summit is always the hardest. All that politeness pressing down on everything feels like the air is thicker." He glanced at me briefly. "Helps to look at something that doesn't care about any of it." I turned back to the window. He wasn't wrong, actually. "You've been to many summits?" I asked. "A few." He didn't elaborate. He just kept looking at the planet. We stood there for a minute in what was, surprisingly, comfortable silence. Then his communication earpiece chimed and he touched it, said "coming" quietly, and walked back toward the human delegation's suite. I watched him go and thought, odd person for a grade 7. Chapter 3, Day 2, when the tension started showing. The second day is when summits begin to get real. The pleasantries are done and the actual positions start emerging from beneath them, and that's when you discover how far apart both sides actually are. They were far apart. The core dispute, leaving aside the 40 years of subtext and misread gestures and cultural friction, was territory in a zone called the Karavath Passage. It was a natural gravitational corridor between 2 large stellar bodies that made it the most efficient transit route in the local cluster. Humans wanted expanded access. The Kethosi wanted to maintain strict control and charge transit fees commensurate with, in the human delegation's view, absolute extortion. Behind that was a deeper question neither side was saying out loud, which was, who has precedence in this region? The Kethosi had been here for 9,000 years. Humans had been here for 130. In the Kethosi worldview, precedence was not just legal or political, it was metaphysically significant. their oldest word for foreigner, translated roughly as one who has not yet earned the right to the sky. The human delegation understood this intellectually. Understanding it emotionally was harder. Humans, in my observation, tend to feel that being somewhere for 130 years is a pretty substantial stake. 130 years is a long time in a human life. It is less than 2% of Kethosi recorded civilization. These two frameworks were sitting across a table from each other, and both sides were trying to negotiate, as if the other one understood intuitively what made their frame of reference feel obvious. It was going to be a difficult day. Secretary Okafor and Ambassador Treshvacal were in the third hour of a technical discussion about transit fee structures when it happened. The ambassador had been getting, if I am honest, increasingly frustrated. His secondary arms, the small lower ones, had been moving in tight, repetitive patterns that I recognized from my reading as a Kethosi stress indicator. He was trying not to show it in his primary posture, which remained composed, but those small arms gave him away to anyone who knew what to look for. The human legal attaché, a man named Counselor Ferris, who was technically very competent and interpersonally somewhat oblivious, had just finished laying out a detailed breakdown of why the proposed transit fee schedule was inconsistent with the Galactic Commerce Guidelines of the 2887 Accord. It was a correct argument. It was also, in retrospect, precisely the wrong argument to make at that moment, in that way, to that person. Ambassador Treshvacal responded through his translator in clipped, formal Kethosi standard, which came through in English as, "The Accord of 2887 was written by humans and ratified by species who were, at that time, in significant political debt to human interests. It does not carry the authority the counselor implies." "With respect, Ambassador," Counselor Ferris said, and I want to note that when humans say, with respect, in that particular tone, it is often the opposite of respectful. "The Accord is the foundational framework for all commercial transit rights and was ratified by your own government's predecessor delegation." "My government's predecessor delegation ratified it under significant duress," the translator said, in the flat, careful voice that all translators use when rendering something that is clearly being delivered with intensity. "Following the Veshka incident. Your people know this. You choose not to speak of it." The Veshka incident was a chapter of history that I knew about, and that I also knew the human delegation had been specifically briefed to avoid referencing. The room temperature, metaphorically speaking, dropped about 10 degrees. Secretary Okafor moved to intervene. She was good at this, stepping into the silence before it could become a wound. She began a carefully modulated acknowledgement of the ambassador's point, designed to de-escalate without conceding anything substantial. And that's when the Kethosi aide, Vilith San, made her move. She leaned toward the ambassador to pass him a document, his copy of the morning's preliminary agreement terms, and in doing so, she stepped slightly to her left to avoid the edge of the table, directly into the path of Cale Drant, who was at that exact moment moving quietly along the far side of the room to place a revised display document at Secretary Okafor's position. They collided, softly, the way you collide with someone when you don't see them, a shoulder glancing off an arm, neither of them moving fast enough to fall. The document scattered. Some of Vilith San's papers went to the floor. She made a startled sound. It should have been a nothing moment. It should have been, both parties say sorry, pick up the papers, and the summit continues. What actually happened was this. Ambassador Treshvacal, who was already on edge, turned at the sound of his aide's startled cry. He saw, from across the table, a human, the human who was closest to his aide, and in the fraction of a second before any context could register, his face did something I had never seen a Kethosi face do. It went absolutely still, not calm, still, the way things go still just before they move very fast. He was on his feet before anyone fully realized he'd moved. Those broad, heavy legs crossed the distance to the end of the table in 4 steps that seemed both very slow and very fast simultaneously. His primary arms were raised in a posture I recognized from the cultural briefings: warding display, defensive aggression, a Kethosi protecting their lineage ward. In Kethosi culture, an aide of that status was a lineage ward. Touching them without permission, even accidentally, was a significant transgression. I knew this. Every senior member of the human delegation knew this. But in the chaos of the moment, with papers on the floor and Velith San making distressed sounds, what Ambassador Treshvacal saw was, a human is touching my ward. He crossed the room, and he struck Kale Drant across the face with his open palm. I want to be very precise about what happened in the next several seconds, because every second mattered. The blow came from the ambassador's right primary arm, which meant it came from a limb built for high-gravity movement, and carrying the strength of 9,000 years of evolutionary pressure on a world that wanted to kill you. It was not a full strike. Even in his anger, Treshvacal had pulled back from full force, but pulled back for a Kethosi arm was still a significant impact. The sound it made was the kind of sound that makes a room go silent. Kale Drant's head snapped to the side. He stumbled one step, put out a hand to catch himself against the edge of the table, and stopped. There was a cut on his cheekbone, just below the eye. The edge of one of the ambassador's decorative wristbands had caught him. It wasn't deep, but it bled, that immediate bright red that makes people react even before they've fully processed what they're seeing. The room, which had been filled with the quiet, controlled noise of a diplomatic session, was now absolutely, completely silent. Secretary Ockhafer was on her feet. The two human security personnel were on their feet and moving. 3 members of the Kethosi retinue were moving. Commander Ashvith's aide was speaking rapidly into a communications device. Velith San looked like she might be sick. Everyone was moving. Every eye was on either the ambassador or Drant. I was watching Drant. He straightened up, slowly. He put a hand to his cheek, looked at the blood on his fingers, not in a shocked way, more like checking the oil level in an engine, a quick functional assessment, and then he lowered his hand. He did not back away, he did not look frightened, he did not look angry. His expression was, and I have thought about how to describe this many times since, settled. Like someone who has received unexpected information and is processing it calmly. His eyes moved to the ambassador's face, and his own face was completely without the defensiveness or the threat response, or even the hurt that I would have expected from someone who had just been struck hard enough to draw blood. He just looked at the ambassador, and he said something, quietly, in Kethosi. Not translated Kethosi, not textbook Kethosi. Spoken Kethosi with the specific tonal inflection of the old dialect, the pre-expansion dialect that the Kethosi hadn't commonly used in public contexts for about 400 years. He said, I learned later exactly what he said, from the chamber's audio archive, because I couldn't quite hear it at the time, he said. Teshvraku, honored elder. The stone does not seek the river's apology. It's an old Kethosi proverb, ancient actually. It's the kind of saying that Kethosi use when they want to indicate that they take no offense from something that was done out of instinct rather than intention, but it carries layers. It's also a statement of patience, of permanence. Stones outlast rivers. And it's impossible to say fluently, unless you've spent significant time immersed in classical Kethosi linguistic study. The room got even quieter, which I hadn't thought was possible. Ambassador Treshvacal looked at the human assistant, this grade 7 nobody who carried documents and refilled water, and his expression did something I have genuinely never seen any face do before or since. It was like watching a mask shift, not fall off. Just shift slightly, revealing that there was a great deal more underneath than anyone had been shown. Chapter 4, The Security Intervention, and what followed. Let me tell you what should have happened next, according to every protocol in the Diplomatic Monitoring Office Manual. Security personnel intervene. The offending party, the ambassador in this case, is separated from the injured party. A formal complaint is lodged. The summit is suspended while both delegations review the incident. Given that an accredited diplomat had physically struck a member of another delegation, this was likely grounds for a major diplomatic incident. The already fragile summit would be at severe risk. There would be emergency consultations. People would make frantic communications back to their respective governments. It would be, in short, a catastrophe. That's what should have happened. What actually happened was that Kale Drant held up his hand. He turned toward the approaching human security personnel, keeping himself fully visible to the ambassador as he did, keeping his posture open and non-threatening, and he held up his hand in the standard diplomatic gesture for stand down. Calm, flat palm, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't make it a command. He just held up his hand. And they stopped. Now I want to be very clear about something. Those security personnel were not low-level guards. They were trained diplomatic corps security officers. They had their own chain of command. The Grade 7 assistant carrying documents had zero authority in their chain of command. None. The correct response to a Grade 7 telling them to stand down was to continue their intervention. They stopped. I remember looking at them and looking at him and thinking, what just happened? Secretary Ockhaffer was also looking at her Grade 7 assistant with an expression that I can only describe as carefully showing nothing while clearly feeling something very significant. Drant turned back to Ambassador Treshvacal. He spoke again, this time in a louder voice, still in Kethosi formal register this time, the kind you use in a ceremonial context. The chamber translators caught it and rendered it. I ask that we take a short recess, 10 minutes. I would like to speak with the ambassador privately, if he would permit it. The silence that followed was one of the more complex silences I've sat inside. There were a dozen different currents of shock and calculation and confusion, and something that in the ambassador's face looked like it might be dawning recognition. A Grade 7 staff member does not make requests of ambassadors, said Councillor Ferris, because apparently someone had to say the obvious wrong thing. Nobody paid him any attention. Ambassador Treshvacal looked at Cale Drant for a long, weighted moment. Those iridescent eyes doing something that I couldn't read, but that felt important. Then he inclined his head, a Kethosi acknowledgement gesture, and spoke in a low voice to his translator, who said, "The ambassador grants the recess. He will speak with the human representative privately." Human representative, not human assistant. The word he used in Kethosi was Vilath Khan, which technically translates as the one who speaks for, or more precisely, the one who carries the true voice. I wrote it down immediately. I underlined it twice. They went into one of the side chambers off the main hall. A small room, I'd been in it before. It had one table and 6 chairs, and a window that looked at nothing because it was on the interior of the station. A neutral space, very deliberately featureless. Drant and the ambassador. One translator, the ambassador's, a Kethosi woman named Chevalion who had been on the translation corps for 30 years. No security, no attachés, no Secretary Ockhaffer. I was not in the room. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you what happened based on the chamber audio logs that I was later given access to as part of the formal incident review, the ambassador's own subsequent public statements, and the account that Drant himself gave to the monitoring office 3 weeks after the summit concluded. This is what happened in that room. Ambassador Treshvacal spoke first. He spoke in Kethosi, which Chevalion translated. "You speak the old dialect. Where did you learn it?" Drant said, "From recordings mostly, and from 2 years studying at the Kethosi Cultural Archive on Vethara Prime." He said this in Kethosi, not translated, and added, "I studied under scholar Drevath Khan. He was one of your lineage, I believe." The ambassador's secondary arms went very still. He said something to his translator in a tone that the audio log suggests was sharp, and then seemed to reconsider and said it himself. "Drevath Khan was my mother's uncle. He died 4 years ago." "I know," Drant said. "I attended the memorial service. I was one of 2 non-Kethosi who were invited. He was, and here, according to the translation log, there was a pause. He was someone who changed how I understood things. I owe him a great deal." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the ambassador said, "Who are you?" And here's the part that I've gone back to in the audio log more times than I can count, because the way Drant answered told me everything about why the security guards had stopped when he held up his hand, and why Secretary Ockhaffer had shown nothing while clearly feeling something very significant, and why a Grade 7 staff member had been assigned to carry documents at a summit where the stakes were 9,000 years of civilization versus 130 years of ambition. He said, "My name is Cale Drant. I have a Grade 7 staff designation. I carry documents and take notes and fill water when it's needed." He paused. "I'm also the person who wrote the preliminary framework document that brought both sides back to this table after 3 years." Another pause. "And I'm the person who, 4 months ago, had a 16-hour conversation with your senior cultural advisor, Preth Vakal, I believe he's your nephew, about whether there was a version of this summit that could actually work." and he told me something that I've been thinking about ever since. The ambassador was completely still. What did he tell you? He told me that the hardest thing about dealing with humans isn't our aggression or our speed or our short memories. He said the hardest thing is that we don't understand what it means to be old. That we treat 9,000 years of civilization the same way we'd treat 9,000 years of infrastructure, something to be assessed and leveraged, not something to be. Another pause. He seemed to be choosing the word carefully. Honored. The audio log records approximately 11 seconds of silence. Then Ambassador Treshvacal said in Kethosi something that Chevalion translated as, "Why are you carrying documents?" And Drant said, "Because I asked to. Secretary Akaffer offered me the lead attaché position. I thought if I was in the room differently, if I was there without the weight of title, I might be able to hear things that someone in a formal position might miss." You chose to be invisible. I chose to be present. Without the armor that titles put on people. A beat. Also, Ambassador, I want to say something about what happened in the chamber. You received a blow. I startled your aide. The misunderstanding was mine to address. I should have been more careful. Your response was, and here Drant, according to his own subsequent account, said something that he'd thought about very carefully. He said, "Your response was appropriate to what you believed you were seeing. I don't hold it." The old Kethosi phrase for "I don't hold it" is a very specific legal moral declaration. It means, I place no debt upon you for this. The account is closed. It's the kind of phrase that in Kethosi culture removes all obligation and all shame from a transgression. It requires sincere intent to be valid. You can't say it and mean it halfway. The ambassador was quiet again. Then he said, "The stone does not seek the river's apology." He was repeating Drant's proverb back to him. "Yes," Drant said. "You have studied us," the ambassador said. "Not as curiosities, not as obstacles. I have studied you because," and here, according to his own account, Drant hesitated in a way that was genuine and not performed. "Because my teacher Drevath Khan told me once that the greatest gift one civilization can give another is the effort of genuine understanding. Not perfect understanding. You never get perfect, but genuine effort. The willingness to try to see the shape of another people's world." Chevalion, the translator, who according to the audio log had been completely silent throughout this entire conversation until this point, said something. In Kethosi, quietly, she said, "Drevath Khan taught me too." And that was the moment the room changed. I can hear it in the audio. Something in the ambient sound shifts. It's subtle, a slight change in the quality of breath in the space, the kind of thing you only catch if you listen carefully. But it shifted. Chapter 5, The Return. They came back into the chamber 43 minutes after they'd left. I had spent those 43 minutes watching the two delegations exist in the same space, in a state of extraordinary, tightly controlled tension. Secretary Akaffer had her game face on, which was to say she looked exactly as calm as she always looked, which meant she was probably working very hard to look that calm. Councillor Ferris had spent 20 minutes very quietly being told things by one of the senior attachés, after which he'd sat back in his chair and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has just been informed he missed something very large and is still working out what it was. Vilith San, the Kethosi aide, had been sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her head slightly bowed for most of the recess, which I recognized as a posture of formal remorse. She was holding herself responsible for the collision that had triggered the incident, and she was not yet sure if she would be held accountable for it. When the door opened and both of them came back in, Drant first, then the ambassador, then Chevalion, Vilith San looked up and her expression went through about 6 things at once. The ambassador spoke to her immediately, 3 words in Kethosi. His translator didn't render them, they seemed personal, not meant for the room, but I saw Vilith San's posture change completely. She sat up straight and her hands unclenched. Then the ambassador looked at the room at large and said, through his translator, "The recess has been productive. I propose that we continue the session." He paused. Then he said in English, not translated, his own English, accented and slightly stiff but completely comprehensible, "I also wish to formally acknowledge that my action was not appropriate to the situation, and I extend recognition of this to the human delegation." This was not an apology in the human sense. Kethosi don't exactly apologize. What they do is acknowledge that an action was not appropriate to its context, and extend recognition of this, which is a formal statement that they have assessed and revised their understanding. It's actually more binding than a human apology in some ways, because it's a statement about comprehension rather than just feeling. Secretary Acaffer received it with precisely calibrated grace. She said something brief and fitting, and then they all sat back down. Cale Drant took his position to one side, next to the display equipment. His cheek had a small piece of medical film on it. Someone had attended to the cut during the recess. He was holding a stylus and a document case, and his expression was the exact same quiet, undramatic presence he'd had when I'd first noticed him that morning. Except that now I was looking at him differently. Chapter 6, What the Summit Became. I'm going to skip forward a little, because the remaining days of the summit, 4 more full sessions, 2 informal dinners, 1 late-night working group that lasted until 3 in the morning station time, were extremely complex in their content and less interesting to narrate than they were to live through. What I want to tell you is what changed. The dynamic shifted, visibly, measurably, in ways that I documented in my observation logs and that were later confirmed by every other observer who had been present. Ambassador Treshvacal began speaking directly. Not through his translator for everything, he started using his own, accented English for certain statements, particularly the ones that felt most personal to him. This was significant. Senior Kethosi diplomats almost never speak the other party's language directly. It's considered a concession. He stopped treating it as a concession and started treating it as a bridge. Secretary Acaffer found a way into his worldview, partly because of her own considerable skill, and partly, I have to believe, because someone had given her extremely useful context about exactly how to frame certain arguments in ways that would resonate with the Kethosi sense of precedence and honor rather than bumping against it. That someone, I believe, was Cale Drant. I watched him through the remaining sessions. I watched him the way I should have been watching him from the beginning. He was almost never the one speaking. He was almost always the one listening. When he did speak, in a private word to Secretary Acaffer before she made a key point, or in a quiet exchange with Chevalier during a break that I was too far away to hear, things shifted slightly. Positions became possible that hadn't been possible a moment before. He was, I realized, a translator, not of language, of meaning, of the gap between what one side intended and what the other side heard, of the space between a culture's oldest values and another culture's newest ambitions. He was doing it invisibly, the way he'd chosen to be invisible in the room, carrying documents and filling water and standing to one side with a stylus and a case. On the 4th day, during an evening session that had been going for 3 hours longer than scheduled, there was a moment. We're stuck. The transit fee structure had been refined through 4 days of negotiation into something that was almost workable, percentages and volume thresholds and exception, clauses that both sides could nearly accept. But there was one remaining element that kept hitting a wall. The Kethosi wanted a clause that gave them the right to close the corridor for what they called ceremonial periods, specific dates in the Kethosi ceremonial calendar that had deep religious significance, 12 days a year. During those 12 days, no non-Kethosi traffic through the corridor. From a purely practical standpoint, the human delegation's position was 12 days a year of closed transit, with no advance warning beyond the traditional 48 hours, was commercially and logistically devastating for the supply chains of 3 colony clusters. It wasn't a negotiating position they could accept. From the Kethosi standpoint, the ceremonial calendar was sacred and could not be subordinated to commercial considerations. To even ask them to do so was an insult to their deepest cultural framework. Both sides were correct. Both positions were incompatible. This was the knot. It had been going around in circles for 2 hours. The room had the particular exhausted tension of people who have been working very hard for a very long time and are beginning to wonder if there's actually a solution. I was on my 4th coffee. It was very bad coffee. The human and Kethosi legal teams had laid out the same positions 11 times in slightly different words. Secretary Acaffer looked, for the first time in the summit, like she was tired. Ambassador Treshvacal had gone still and remote in the way he did when he was retreating behind formality. Cale Drant, who had been standing to one side for the past 2 hours, set down his document case. He said, "May I ask a question?" Every person in that room looked at him. The grade 7, the document carrier, the water refiller. Nobody said no. The ceremonial periods, do they follow the astronomical calendar? Or are they calculated in advance by your ceremonial scholars? Ambassador Treshvakal's translator relayed the question. The ambassador's eyes moved to Drant. He said something brief to Vilith San, who consulted a document and said, through the translator, calculated 18 months in advance by the Clade scholars, published in the Great Register. And the Great Register, it's publicly available to any party who requests access. Another brief exchange. The Great Register is a public document of the Kethosi Dominion. Any party may access it. Drant looked at Secretary Akaffer. She was already looking at him with a very specific expression. So, he said carefully, the ceremonial dates are known 18 months in advance. He didn't say anything else, he just let it sit there. And the room, very slowly, figured out what he'd said. 18 months advance notice, not 48 hours, 18 months, which meant that human commercial shipping companies would have 18 months to schedule around the closure periods, which meant the disruption wasn't random and unplanned, it was predictable, schedulable, manageable. The impasse that had been running in circles for 2 hours had a door in it that nobody had thought to look for. I watched Secretary Akaffer's face go through the realization. I watched Ambassador Treshvakal's face do the same thing from the other direction. I watched Counselor Ferris open his mouth, close it, and then, to his credit, stay quiet. The ambassador said something to his translator, who said, "The ambassador notes that the Great Register's availability was not previously raised in these discussions." Secretary Akaffer said, "You're right, it wasn't. That was an oversight on our part, and I'm grateful it's been raised now." She did not look at Drant when she said it. Neither did the ambassador. Both of them were, I believe, deliberately not drawing attention to who had raised it. They broke for the evening 40 minutes later with a draft agreement framework that included a provision, elegant in its simplicity, requiring the Kethosi to share the next 3 years of the Great Register's ceremonial schedule with human transit authorities at the start of each year, and for human commercial routes to provide their optimized schedules for the corridor in return. Mutual transparency. Mutual accommodation. The corridor would close for the 12 ceremonial days as the Kethosi required. The disruption would be manageable as the humans required. Both sides had gotten what they needed. Nobody had given up anything that mattered. Chapter 7. What Ambassador Treshvakal said at the signing. The final session was on the 6th day. The signing of the preliminary framework, the document that would go back to both governments for formal ratification, and that would, everyone in the room believed, eventually become the governing treaty for the next generation of Kethosi human relations in the Amber Cradle. It was a formal occasion, both delegations in their most formal attire, photographers and documentation officers from 4 different monitoring bodies. Commander Ashvith had authorized additional atmospheric composition for the chamber, which meant the air smelled more strongly of Accord 7 than usual, which I've always thought was cheating slightly, but I understood the logic. Secretary Akaffer signed for the human side. Ambassador Treshvakal signed for the Kethosi side. The signing tools were different. Humans use styluses on display surfaces. Kethosi use carved impression seals on actual material documents. And there was a long negotiation several months prior about how to make both formats legally binding simultaneously, which had been resolved with a sort of dual authentication system that I found genuinely impressive. When both signatures were done, there was a moment. The kind of moment that rooms like that are built for. Cameras and observers and the weight of consequence all pressing into the same instant. Ambassador Treshvakal spoke. His translator stood to relay it, but the ambassador stopped her with a gesture. He was going to say this in English, his own voice, accented and deliberate and clear. He said, "We have reached this agreement through many hours of difficult and necessary work. Secretary Akaffer and her delegation have shown patience and skill." He paused. His iridescent eyes moved to a specific point in the room. "There is also a student of the old ways who carried documents in this room. I do not know if it is appropriate to name him, but I wish to say, Drevath Khan would have been pleased." He said the name as Kethosi say it, with the correct tonal weight on the second syllable that indicates respect for the dead, the way Drant had probably said it when he attended the memorial service. The room was very quiet. Drant was standing against the far wall. He had a document case under his arm and a stylus in his hand, and he looked like a person who very much wanted to remain against the wall and not be looked at. He inclined his head, a small, genuine acknowledgement. Not a bow, that's not a Kethosi gesture, just a tilt of the head, direct and held for a moment. The way Kethosi acknowledge peers. He'd learned that from Drevath Khan too, I'd bet. Chapter 8, After the Room. The delegations filtered out. The documentation officers did their work. Commander Ashvath's staff began the process of converting the chamber back into whatever its next configuration would be. I think there was a trade negotiation between two other species the following week, something about mineral extraction rights. I stayed until most people had gone. Force of habit from 11 years of noting things at the end. Drant was still there too, packing up the display equipment. Quiet, systematic, moving through the process the way he moved through everything, without fuss, without performance. I walked over to him. "Delegate Observer Senavral," I said. "I've been observing this summit for the monitoring office. I want to say I think I have completely failed to do my job this week, in the sense that I missed something very significant until very late." He looked at me sideways with that small, tired smile. "Most people did," he said. It wasn't dismissive, it was just honest. "Can I ask, the framework document, the one you wrote, how long did it take?" He thought about it. The draft, maybe 6 weeks, but the thinking behind it. The actual understanding of what both sides needed. That took longer. Years, probably. You don't figure out what someone needs until you've spent enough time listening that you stop hearing what you expect and start hearing what's actually there. He clicked a case closed, stacked it with the others. "You studied under a Kethosi scholar," I said. "He was the best teacher I ever had. He had a saying in Kethosi, but it translates roughly as, every language is a different way of touching the world. Learning one is not enough. Learning one makes you think you understand touching. You need more than one before you realize how many different ways there are." He picked up the stack of cases. "For what it's worth," I said, "Ambassador Treshvakal called you Velith Khan." He paused, just for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I heard." And then, because he was Kale Drant, and this was how he operated, he said nothing more about it. He just picked up his cases, nodded to me politely, and walked out of the chamber toward wherever Grade 7 assistants went when the summit was over. Chapter 9, What I Found Out Later. I spent several months afterward doing what I suppose you'd call informal research, which in practice meant pulling every publicly available document and record that I could find associated with Kale Drant. What I found was carefully, deliberately minimal. He had a personnel file with the Human Diplomatic Corps dating back 12 years, Grade 7, various summit assignments, unremarkable performance notes. The kind of notes you get when someone is making a specific, sustained effort to be unremarkable. He had an academic record from 14 years ago that showed studies at the Institute for Interspecies Communications. Decent marks, nothing extraordinary. The kind of marks that don't attract attention. What didn't show up in the standard personnel file? 2 years at the Kethosi Cultural Archive on Vethara Prime, which he'd apparently attended on a private study fellowship that wasn't government-sponsored, and therefore didn't appear in diplomatic corps records. A published paper, just one, under a different name that I only found by following a citation thread back through a Kethosi academic journal, on the historical context of the Veshka incident and its ongoing influence on Kethosi human diplomatic dynamics. The paper was technically excellent and had been apparently very widely read in Kethosi academic circles. And a single entry in the personal communications of the late scholar Drevath Khan, published posthumously as part of a Kethosi academic memorial volume, a letter he had written to his lineage about his human student. The letter said, in part, "He comes and sits and asks questions in the old manner, not the quick questions of someone collecting information, but the slow questions of someone trying to understand. He sat with me for 4 days before he asked his first real question. That is patience, not human patience, which is a performance, the other kind." The letter was written 7 years before the summit. I read it twice. Then I submitted my formal observation report to the Diplomatic Monitoring Office, which ran to about 400 pages and did not mention Kale Drant by name anywhere in it. partly because I couldn't work out what to call him or how to categorize what he'd done. I later heard, through the kind of informal network of observers and attaches that forms in this field, that after the summit, Drant had been offered a senior-level diplomatic posting, formally, with a title and a seat at the table. He had, apparently, asked if he could stay at grade 7 for the moment. The person who told me this shook their head and said, "He's insane." I thought about it for a while, and then I said, "Or he knows something about where the important work actually happens." Chapter 10, the document that changed things, and the one that didn't need to. 3 months after the summit, the Kethosi Human Amber Cradle Framework was formally ratified by both governments. It went through several rounds of revision during the ratification process. Governments always added things and removed things and adjusted language in ways that made lawyers happy and made diplomats quietly furious. But the core of it, the thing that made it work, remained intact. The Great Register Clause, the mutual transparency provision. The thing that turned 12 days of closed transit from a wall into a window. The ratified treaty was 847 pages long. The Great Register Clause was 3 paragraphs. Those 3 paragraphs opened the Caravath Passage. Hundreds of supply ships began making the run without the detour within months. Colony clusters that had been running on stretched margins began receiving supplies on workable schedules. The economic models, as I understand it, improved significantly. The Human Diplomatic Corps issued a formal press statement calling it a landmark achievement in interspecies relations. Ambassador Treshvakal gave a statement to the Kethosi Public Information Service. He said, "I'm working from a translation here, that the agreement honored Kethosi precedents and Kethosi values, and that he had found, in the course of the negotiations, evidence that some humans were capable of genuine understanding of things older than themselves." He didn't name anyone, but Chevalion, his translator, mentioned in a later interview that during the private meeting on the second day of the summit, she had felt, for the first time in 30 years of translation work, that she was not needed. Not because the language was clear, she said, because something else was clear underneath the language. I think about the morning of the slap a lot. I think about what it must have felt like to take that blow, that heavy, high-gravity strike, sharp enough to cut and hold yourself still. To not react from fear or anger. To stand there, blood on your face, and say the old words, the patient words. The stone does not seek the river's apology. I think about how long it takes to become the stone. How many years of sitting and listening in the old manner. How many hours studying a dead dialect in an archive on a world not your own. How many memorial services attended for teachers you loved. How many document cases carried, and water glasses refilled, and moments of quiet presence offered to rooms full of people who didn't know they needed it. Cale Drant was a grade 7 assistant. He carried documents, he took notes. He refilled water when it was needed. He was also the most important person in that room. The alien diplomat slapped him. She and everyone else in that chamber had absolutely no idea who he really was. But he knew, and knowing was enough. Because the stone doesn't need you to recognize it. It just needs to be there, solid and patient and older than the river. Waiting for the moment when being present and being genuine, and having spent years learning how to truly touch another world, turns out to be exactly enough to change everything. Epilogue 7 years later. I met Cale Drant once more, 7 years after the summit. I was at a small academic conference on interspecies communication methodologies, not the big summits, the quiet ones, where the people who think about how understanding actually works gather and talk to each other without a lot of cameras. Someone had organized a panel on experiential diplomatic learning, the kind of knowledge you can't get from briefing documents. He was on the panel. Still grade 7, someone told me when I arrived and asked about the speakers. I laughed out loud. The person who told me looked confused. He gave a short talk, 20 minutes. He spoke slowly and without notes, the way people speak when they're saying things they've thought about for a long time and no longer need to rehearse. He talked about his teacher on Vethara Prime. He talked about what it means to listen in the old manner. He talked about the difference between collecting information about a culture and beginning to understand the shape of the world as that culture experiences it. He said, "We spend a lot of time in this field trying to reduce misunderstanding. That's important. But I think the deeper work, The work that actually changes things is creating the conditions for genuine comprehension, which is slower, which requires being in the room differently, which sometimes means carrying the documents instead of reading from them. Someone in the audience asked him about the Amber Cradle Summit. The question was carefully framed, respectful but clearly fishing. He smiled the same small, tired smile I remembered. "I was a staff member at that summit," he said. "I carried documents and took notes. Secretary Ockhafer led a remarkable negotiation. Ambassador Treshvackle showed extraordinary generosity of spirit in a moment that could have gone very differently." He paused. "Those are the things worth noting." The questioner pushed, but wasn't there an incident involving? "Ambassador Treshvackle has spoken about the summit publicly," Drant said gently. "I'd encourage you to read his account. He says things better than I would." He deflected it with such complete naturalness that the conversation moved on before the questioner quite realized it had. Afterward, during the informal part of the conference, I found him standing by a window, another window. He had a cup of something warm and was looking out at something. Not a planet this time, just a city, gray and rainy. The kind of ordinary midday city scene that appears in no one's diplomatic briefing. "Delegate Observer Vral," he said. He remembered me. "I still think about the stone proverb," I said. He nodded, looking at the rain. "Drevath Khan's version was slightly different from the common one," he said. "The way he recited it, it went, 'The stone does not seek the river's apology, but the stone remembers the river's shape in time.'" He paused. He said that was the part most people left out, the remembering. I thought about that. "The stone learns from the river," I said. "They both change each other," he said. "That's the whole point. Not the stone winning over the river. Both of them becoming something they couldn't have become alone." He drank whatever was in his cup. Outside, the rain came down on the ordinary city, gray and patient. "Are you ever going to take the senior posting?" I asked. He thought about it. "Maybe," he said, "when the work that needs doing requires a title instead of a document case." He smiled at the window. "We're not there yet."